My name is Percy O'Halloran, and for close to 4 months, I paid for internet service that inexplicably ran slower every single evening between roughly 6 and 11, exactly the hours I most wanted to actually use it. A mystery I finally solved on a Saturday afternoon when I pulled a section of drywall away from my shared unit wall to run a new outlet and discovered a professionally drilled hole, threaded with a length of Ethernet cable that did not belong to me. Running directly into the unit next door, the unit belonging to Winifred Ashcombe, president of my condominium association's homeowners board. She had drilled through shared wall structure without my knowledge, without my permission, and without ever once considering that a shared wall in a condominium is not remotely the same thing as a shared internet account, tapping directly into my router to save herself the cost of her own separate service for what turned out to be the better part of a year. I did not confront her immediately. I did not call an attorney first. I did something considerably more satisfying. I quietly researched exactly how her stolen connection was being used, discovered she ran nearly all of her smart home devices through it, including, most usefully for what came next, a set of exterior speakers she used for a small backyard water feature. And over the following 2 weeks, I slowly and deliberately replaced every single piece of soothing nature audio those speakers had ever played with an escalating, increasingly unhinged rotation of goat noises that played at random, unpredictable intervals for 18 straight days before she ever figured out why her tranquil garden had apparently become haunted. Part 1. I want to explain the layout of my condominium and exactly how this wall-sharing situation worked before describing what I found, because understanding the physical structure here matters enormously for both how genuinely invasive Winifred's actions turned out to be and how I was eventually able to turn her own theft back around on her so effectively. I live in a condominium community called Larkspur Court, 36 units arranged in connected rows, sharing structural walls between adjacent units the way most attached condominium developments do. I purchased my unit close to 5 years ago, and my direct neighbor, sharing the wall between our living rooms and continuing back through a section of our respective kitchens, was Winifred Ashcombe, who I knew, prior to any of this happening, primarily as the president of our small HOA, a role she had held for roughly 3 years by the time this situation unfolded. My interactions with Winifred before this had been entirely ordinary, occasional pleasant exchanges in the shared parking area, the standard low-level familiarity that develops between people who live in close physical proximity without ever becoming genuinely close. I had absolutely no reason, going into this, to suspect she was capable of anything resembling what I eventually discovered. I want to walk through how I first noticed something was genuinely wrong, because the slow, gradual nature of the problem made it considerably harder to identify than I think most people would expect. I work partially from home, and reliable internet performance matters enormously for my job, so when I began noticing, roughly 4 months before this story reaches its resolution, that my connection speed seemed to drop noticeably every evening starting around 6 o'clock and remaining sluggish until sometime after 11, I initially assumed this was simply a broader issue with my internet service provider. The kind of general network congestion that affects an entire neighborhood during peak usage hours. I called my provider about this pattern on 2 separate occasions over those first several weeks, and both times, their diagnostic checks came back showing my actual service line performing exactly as it should, with no indication of any provider-side congestion or technical issue whatsoever, a result that genuinely puzzled both me and the support representatives I spoke with. Since the pattern I was describing was consistent and repeatable, but apparently had no explanation on their end of the connection. I let the issue sit unresolved for longer than I probably should have, partly out of simple frustration with how unproductive those support calls had been, and partly because, while genuinely annoying, the slowdown was not severe enough to completely prevent me from working, simply frustrating enough to notice consistently without ever quite reaching the threshold where I felt compelled to invest serious additional time investigating it further. The actual discovery happened almost entirely by accident, connected to a completely unrelated home improvement project. I had decided to add an additional electrical outlet in my living room, positioned along the wall I shared with Winifred's unit, and while cutting into the drywall to run the necessary wiring, I found something that had absolutely nothing to do with electrical work and everything to do with explaining months of mysterious evening internet slowdowns. A clean, professionally drilled hole passed directly through the shared wall structure at a point roughly 3 feet up from the floor, considerably more precise and deliberate than any kind of accidental damage or pre-existing construction feature, threaded through with a length of Ethernet cable that ran, based on what I could trace with a flashlight, directly through to whatever was on the other side of that wall in Winifred's unit. I want to describe my reaction to finding this, because it moved through several distinct stages fairly quickly. Initial confusion, since I genuinely could not immediately think of any legitimate explanation for a deliberately drilled hole threaded with unfamiliar cable running through my own living room wall. Then, as I traced the cable back toward my own router, sitting on a shelf considerably closer to that same wall than I had ever thought much about before, a rapidly dawning and increasingly certain understanding of exactly what I was actually looking at. I disconnected the cable from my router entirely, and within about 10 minutes, using a network monitoring app on my phone that displayed connected devices, confirmed something I had already strongly suspected, but wanted verified beyond any doubt before taking any further action. An entire additional set of devices, none of which I recognized as belonging to me, had been actively connected to my home network this entire time, presumably explaining exactly why my available bandwidth had been noticeably reduced every single evening for months. Evenings that, I now understood clearly, likely corresponded directly with whenever Winifred and her own household were most actively using whatever devices she had connected through that stolen line. I want to explain my thinking process at this point, because I did not immediately march next door and confront her, despite how genuinely satisfying that impulse felt in the moment. I have always found that confrontations driven by immediate anger tend to produce considerably less satisfying resolutions than ones approached with a bit more patience and strategic thinking, and something about the sheer audacity of what I had just discovered, an HOA board president literally drilling through shared structural wall to steal a neighbor's internet service for months on end, made me want to understand the full scope of the situation before deciding exactly how I wanted to handle it. I spent the following several days quietly documenting everything I could about the unauthorized connection, taking photographs of the drilled hole and the cable itself from both my own accessible side, screenshotting the network monitoring data showing the unfamiliar connected devices and their usage patterns, and generally building a complete factual record before deciding on my next move, since I understood clearly that whatever happened next, having this kind of documentation available would matter considerably. During this documentation process, examining the network monitoring app more closely than I initially had, I noticed something that would end up becoming the central mechanism of everything satisfying that followed. Among the unfamiliar connected devices, I identified what was clearly a smart speaker system, based on both its device naming convention and its consistent, predictable connection pattern throughout the evening hours, a pattern entirely consistent with ambient background audio playing on a loop rather than any kind of active streaming or browsing behavior. I want to explain how I confirmed exactly what that speaker system was actually being used for, because pure curiosity at this point led me down a path that turned out to be considerably more useful than I initially anticipated. Winifred's condominium, like several units at Larkspur Court including my own, had a small enclosed patio area, and I recalled, now that I was thinking specifically about it, occasionally hearing faint, pleasant nature sounds, birdsong and gentle water trickling, drifting from somewhere near her patio during warmer evenings, sounds I had always simply assumed came from some kind of small decorative water feature she had installed. Exactly the sort of low-key backyard ambience many people enjoy. Based on the device naming and the timing correlation with those evening slowdowns, I became increasingly confident that Winifred was running her entire patio audio system, likely alongside various other smart home devices throughout her unit, through my stolen internet connection rather than paying for her own separate service. A discovery that shifted my thinking considerably about exactly what kind of response would feel most appropriately proportionate to what she had actually been doing to me for months. I want to be completely honest that at this point, I did seriously consider simply confronting her directly and demanding immediate compensation for months of stolen service, an entirely reasonable and legally sound response that I fully understood was available to me. I ultimately decided, however, that before pursuing any kind of formal confrontation, documentation, or legal action, which I certainly still intended to eventually do, I wanted to have a bit of fun with the situation first, given the genuinely remarkable audacity of what she had done, and the fact that I now had complete, unrestricted access to control exactly what content flowed through that stolen connection to her own smart speaker system. I researched, over the following several days, exactly how her particular smart speaker system's audio streaming functioned, confirming that it was pulling ambient soundscape audio from a fairly standard streaming service, one that I, given my complete control over the internet connection those devices were actually running through, had considerably more ability to influence than Winifred likely understood was even possible. I want to describe the actual execution of what followed, because I approached this with what I genuinely believe was a fairly impressive level of restraint and craftsmanship, given how easy it would have been to simply cut her connection off entirely the moment I discovered it, an option that, while immediately satisfying, felt considerably less proportionate and considerably less entertaining than what I actually decided to do instead. Rather than immediately disconnecting her stolen access, I left the physical connection intact, but began carefully monitoring, and through methods I am not going to detail exhaustively here, but that involved intercepting and substituting the specific audio stream her speaker system was pulling, gradually introducing changes to what should have been a peaceful, ambient birdsong and water soundtrack playing on her patio. The first change was subtle, deliberately so, a single brief goat bleat inserted randomly into what was otherwise still the normal peaceful soundtrack, timed to occur at an unpredictable moment rather than any kind of obvious, jarring pattern that would immediately signal something had gone wrong with her system. I wanted, I will admit, for this to feel genuinely mysterious and unsettling to her, rather than simply a broken speaker she could easily diagnose and dismiss as a technical glitch. Over the following days, I gradually escalated this, increasing both the frequency and the volume of the intruding goat noises, occasionally allowing several minutes of normal peaceful ambience to play uninterrupted before a sudden, considerably louder and more prolonged goat bleat would cut through completely unexpectedly. Then, just as suddenly, the normal peaceful soundtrack would resume as though nothing unusual had happened at all. I want to explain why I specifically chose goat noises, since I imagine this detail strikes people as a somewhat unusual choice requiring some explanation. Partly, I will admit, it was simply because I found the concept genuinely funny, a jarring, absurd contrast against what was supposed to be tranquil nature ambience. But partly, and this became relevant later, once Winifred began actually reacting to what was happening, goat sounds carry a specific quality, somewhere between comical and genuinely unsettling, depending on context and volume, that I suspected would prove considerably more effective at generating sustained confusion and mild alarm than something more obviously and immediately identifiable as a prank, like inserting recognizable music or an obvious joke sound effect. The reaction, once it began, exceeded even my own expectations for how effectively this would work. I did not have direct visibility into Winifred's unit, obviously, but living immediately adjacent meant I had a fairly clear auditory window into her general reactions whenever she was out on her patio during the evenings. And within the first week of my escalating goat noise campaign, I began hearing exactly the kind of confused, increasingly agitated muttering through our shared wall that told me clearly this was working considerably better than I had even hoped. I'm going to stop the story here, at the point roughly 2 weeks into this campaign, where the unpredictable goat noises had become frequent and disruptive enough that I could hear Winifred, through our shared wall, on multiple occasions attempting to troubleshoot her own smart speaker system, calling what sounded like customer support lines, and generally descending into a level of genuine bewildered frustration that I found considerably more satisfying to simply listen to than I had anticipated. Because everything that happened over the following several days, the moment she finally traced the problem back far enough to discover exactly whose internet connection her devices had actually been running on this entire time, the confrontation that inevitably followed once she realized I had known about her theft for weeks while quietly turning it into an elaborate prank, and the considerably more serious consequences that followed once the full scope of her unauthorized wall modification and months of stolen service became a matter for the rest of the HOA board to formally address, changed this from a genuinely entertaining personal prank into something that would end Winifred Ashcombe's HOA presidency entirely once her own neighbors learned exactly what she had been doing behind that shared wall. Part 2 picks up with the moment Winifred finally traced her haunted patio speakers back to their actual source. The confrontation that followed once she understood I had known about her theft the entire time, and the emergency board meeting that resulted once the full scope of her unauthorized wall drilling and months of stolen internet service became impossible for the rest of Larkspur Court's residents to ignore.